It was always the same time. Somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, Daniel would wake up in the still darkness of his quiet home. The clock's red glow would stare back at him like a quiet reminder. Again, too early. He'd lie there, in bed, eyes open, mind alert, body unsure of what it needed. There was no obvious reason. No nightmares, no sudden noises, no discomfort. Just a quiet return to wakefulness that left him wondering what, exactly, was happening. He was 71, retired, and in generally good health. So why was sleep slipping through his fingers when he needed it most? This question haunts many older adults. It's a silent, shared experience that few speak about, as if waking at odd hours must mean something is wrong. But what if it didn't? What if these early awakenings weren't a problem, but a message, a signal from a body and mind in transition, responding to subtle internal changes that don't always feel dramatic, but are deeply meaningful nonetheless? As we age, our bodies undergo countless shifts. Hormones recalibrate, routines change, and the rhythms that once guided us with certainty begin to drift. Waking in the early hours is not a sign of weakness or failure. It's a reflection of adaptation, of life responding to itself. These nighttime wake-ups, particularly around 3 a.m., are far more common than most realize, and understanding them is the first step toward peace, not just with sleep, but with aging itself. Daniel eventually began to see those hours not as the enemy, but as an invitation, a call to awareness. He started reading more about sleep and aging, about the natural transformations that make 3 a.m. less of a surprise and more of a gentle checkpoint. What he learned changed everything. There wasn't just one reason behind his early rising. In fact, there were several: biological, behavioral, emotional, all converging to create this new pattern. In the pages ahead, we'll explore 5 key reasons why people like Daniel, and perhaps you, find themselves waking in the darkest hours of the night, not as a list of problems, but as a map. Each cause offers insight into how your body functions, how it shifts with time, and how you can gently respond rather than resist. Because sometimes, what feels like a disruption is really just life asking us to listen. And in that listening, we begin to heal. Harold had always considered himself a solid sleeper. Even in his 60s, he rarely had trouble drifting off at night. He would settle into bed around 10, read for a few minutes, and then sleep would come. Easy, peaceful, steady. But something began to shift after his 72nd birthday. It wasn't falling asleep that was the problem. It was staying asleep. Like clockwork, he would wake up at precisely 3:15 a.m., eyes wide open, mind quiet but alert. The rest of the house remained still, and outside, the world was wrapped in darkness. There was no obvious reason for waking, yet it kept happening. Again and again. At first, Harold worried. Was it stress? Was something wrong with his heart or his mind? He began tracking his habits, trying to see a pattern. That's when he stumbled upon something that seemed almost too simple: melatonin. The word felt distant and scientific, but the more he read, the more it made sense. Melatonin, often called the sleep hormone, is what signals to our brain that it's time to rest. It's naturally produced in the evening, guided by the fading light of the day. But as we age, the body makes less of it. And for Harold, that made all the difference. In his younger years, Harold's body had no trouble staying asleep through the night. His melatonin levels rose steadily in the evening and stayed high until morning. But now, those levels were dipping too early. By 3 in the morning, there simply wasn't enough of the hormone left to keep him in a restful state. His brain, noticing the drop, began to stir, not because of a bad dream or a pressing thought, but because it believed the night was over. Once Harold understood this, everything began to shift. He didn't blame himself anymore. Instead, he made quiet adjustments. He removed the digital clock from his nightstand, as its soft blue light was enough to interrupt melatonin production. He stopped watching TV right before bed, choosing instead to take a short evening walk or sit on the porch in dim light. He even invested in darker curtains to block out the street lamps. Within weeks, his sleep grew deeper again. Not perfect, but better. And more importantly, he felt empowered. No longer lost in confusion, but supported by knowledge. Melatonin wasn't magic, but it was part of the story. A quiet ally in the body's nighttime rhythm. For Harold, understanding. Its role made 3:15 a.m. feel less like a failure and more like a reminder. Aging is change, not loss. And sometimes, change just needs a little support. Charles had never thought much about his sleep habits. In his working years, he rose with the sun and went to bed well after 10, often falling asleep halfway through a late-night documentary. His rhythm felt natural, unquestioned. But after retiring at 68, something began to shift. With no office to rush to and no set obligations, his days grew quieter and his evenings more still. He started eating dinner around 5:30 p.m. and without realizing it, found himself yawning by 8. Before long, his head was hitting the pillow before 9, and by 3 a.m. he was wide awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, wondering why his body was acting like the day had already begun. It puzzled him. He wasn't stressed or uncomfortable. He didn't wake with aches or urgency. He just woke up. Curious and quietly frustrated, Charles started reading about sleep changes in aging, and he discovered something that immediately clicked. The concept of advanced sleep phase. As we age, our internal clocks, known as circadian rhythms, naturally shift forward. This means we start feeling sleepy earlier and tend to wake up earlier too. It wasn't a disorder or an illness. It was biology. His body wasn't broken. It had just quietly reset itself. This realization didn't fix everything overnight, but it changed how Charles approached his evenings. Rather than fight his early wake-ups, he decided to gradually shift his bedtime. He added a gentle walk after dinner, often through his quiet neighborhood streets, listening to the rustling of leaves or the distant hum of a passing car. He avoided overly dim lighting in the evening, opting instead for soft, warm lamps, while he read historical fiction by the fireplace. Sometimes he'd call his daughter for a short conversation, which always left him with a sense of connection and comfort. Over time, these small rituals nudged his sleep cycle forward. He started going to bed closer to 10 and waking up around 5, still early, but not in the dead of night. More importantly, he no longer lay awake wondering what was wrong. He understood that his body was simply responding to age in its own quiet, orderly way. And in honoring that rhythm, he felt more at peace. Charles learned that sometimes sleep doesn't need to be fixed. It needs to be heard. And once we begin to listen, even the most restless hours can teach us how to move with time, not against it. Eleanor had always been a light sleeper, even when she was younger. But in her 70s, something changed. She wasn't just waking briefly to shift positions or adjust her blanket. She was waking fully, completely, as if the night had run its course. Almost every night at around 3:30 a.m., she would open her eyes and feel instantly alert. No panic, no dream, no noise, just awake. At first, she assumed it was simply part of aging, Everyone talked about how older adults didn't sleep as well. But after weeks of fragmented rest and groggy mornings, she knew she needed to look deeper. Eleanor began paying attention to her body more carefully. She noticed subtle things: a dry mouth when she woke, a persistent need to use the bathroom, and occasional cramping in her legs. These weren't dramatic issues, but they seemed to appear like clockwork in the quiet early hours. She also remembered that she had recently started a new blood pressure medication. Curious, she scheduled an appointment with her doctor. To her surprise, her physician confirmed her suspicions. The medication she was taking had a mild diuretic effect, causing her body to release more fluid, and waking her up with the urge to urinate. Additionally, the shift in her body's hydration levels might have been contributing to the leg cramps and restlessness. It wasn't a serious problem, but it was enough to disrupt her rest. With her doctor's help, Eleanor adjusted the timing of her medication, moving the dose to earlier in the day. She also began drinking a little more water in the afternoon and doing light stretches before bed to reduce cramping. Within a week, she was waking less frequently, and even when she did, she found it easier to drift back to sleep. This experience taught Eleanor something profound. Sometimes, our bodies whisper before they shout. A small ache, a subtle change, a new pattern. These are messages, not malfunctions. Aging doesn't mean losing control. It means learning to listen more closely. Eleanor came to see her 3:30 a.m. wake-ups not as a betrayal, but as a form of communication. Now, when she wakes during the night, she doesn't feel anxious. She checks in with herself. Is she warm enough? Does she need water? Is her position comfortable? These small questions, asked with kindness, often guide her gently back to sleep. Her body, after all, wasn't failing. It was speaking. And all it needed was for her to start paying attention. Walter had always prided himself on being a creature of routine. For over 40 years, his days had followed a steady rhythm. Breakfast at 7, work until 5, dinner at 6, and bedtime no earlier than 11. But after retiring at 74, that structure began to dissolve, replaced by long, quiet days and even quieter evenings. At first, it felt like freedom. No alarm clocks, no deadlines, but before long, he noticed something unsettling. He was waking up at 3 a.m. almost every night, fully alert and unsure why. He began tracing his habits and realized how much had shifted. He now ate supper at 5 p.m., sometimes even earlier, if he skipped lunch. By 6:30, he was in his recliner, nodding off during the evening news. And by 8:30, he was often in bed, fast asleep. It hadn't been a conscious decision. It had just happened. His days were so quiet that his body had no strong cues to stay awake longer. The more Walter thought about it, the more he understood that this wasn't insomnia. His body was simply completing its sleep cycle earlier. If he fell asleep at 8:30, then waking at 3 meant nearly 7 hours had passed. A full night's rest by many standards. But waking up so early felt unnatural, especially when the world outside was still cloaked in darkness. He decided to make a few gentle adjustments. First, he delayed dinner by an hour and added a small evening snack, a banana or a piece of toast, to prevent any overnight dips in blood sugar. He also made a point to avoid falling asleep in his recliner. Instead, he'd take a short walk after supper, even just around the backyard, to gently stimulate his body. He replaced the dim lamp he used in the evenings with a brighter, warmer light to encourage alertness a bit longer. Within a couple of weeks, Walter noticed a change. He wasn't necessarily sleeping more hours, but his wake time had shifted closer to 5 or 6 in the morning. He no longer lay in bed frustrated or disoriented in the middle of the night. And most importantly, he began to feel more in sync with his day. The lesson he learned was simple but powerful. Habits shape sleep. Retirement doesn't have to mean surrendering to the earliest hours. With awareness and small changes, even long-standing routines can evolve. And sometimes, all it takes to reclaim your rest is giving your body the gentle guidance it's quietly waiting for. Gloria had always loved the quiet. She found peace in early mornings and calm in the hush of late evenings. But ever since her husband passed away, the quiet had changed. It wasn't restful anymore, it was hollow. And in that silence, particularly around 3 a.m., she often found herself wide awake, staring into the dark, not afraid, but undeniably stirred. At first, she thought it might be a physical issue, but there was no pain, no urgent need, no particular discomfort. Just her mind, gently but persistently awake. During the day, Gloria stayed busy. At 80, she still tended her small garden, watched her favorite programs, and called her grandchildren regularly. But at night, when all the distractions faded, emotions she hadn't fully processed began to rise. Memories of shared meals, late-night laughter, and simple routines with her husband drifted into focus. They weren't painful, not exactly, but they brought with them a soft ache, a quiet longing that didn't seem to sleep when she did. It took her months to understand that these early wake-ups weren't about insomnia. They were about memory, about love, about presence. Her heart hadn't adjusted to the silence in the same way her schedule had, so she decided to meet it with compassion rather than resistance. She placed a small notebook by her bed and started a gentle ritual. When she woke in the night, she would write. Not full essays or emotional outpourings, but simple thoughts. A moment from the day. A memory that visited her. A question that lingered. To her surprise, the act of writing brought a sense of release. She no longer lay still, with spinning thoughts. By giving them form, she gave them rest. She also began a new habit. Every evening, she played soft music, something familiar and comforting, while writing a short note to a friend, even if she didn't plan to send it. This gave her evenings a rhythm of connection, even in solitude. Over time, Gloria stopped fearing her 3 a.m. wake-ups. They became something else. A pause, a breath, a chance to be with herself honestly. Not every night was easy, but many were lighter. She learned something that many older adults discover quietly, on their own. Sometimes the body wakes not because something is wrong, but because something within needs to be heard. And when we listen with kindness, even the loneliest hours can begin to feel like home. There's something sacred about the early morning hours, that soft, in-between place where the night hasn't fully ended and the day hasn't yet begun. For many older adults like Harold, Charles, Eleanor, Walter, and Gloria, waking around 3 a.m. became a shared thread in the quiet fabric of aging. What once felt like a disruption slowly revealed itself as a deeper rhythm. Not brokenness, but change. And like all change, it asked not for resistance, but for understanding. These early wake-ups were never random. They were shaped by the natural decline of melatonin, the quiet shift of internal clocks, the whispers of the body, the echo of long-standing habits, and the stirring of memory and emotion. None of these things were signs of failure. Each was a reminder that life continues to evolve, even, and perhaps especially, in the stillness of night. What all of them discovered, in their own ways, was that sleep isn't just about closing one's eyes and escaping the world. It's a conversation with the self, a reflection of the day lived, the body's needs, the heart's murmurings. And just as we wouldn't scold a friend for needing to talk, we shouldn't scold ourselves for waking. Sometimes 3 a.m. is when the truest part of us speaks. With this new perspective, they each made peace with their nights. Harold adjusted his environment to support his changing melatonin. Charles gently stretched his evenings to match his internal clock. Eleanor listened to her body's signals and worked with her doctor to find a better rhythm. Walter reshaped his routines, reclaiming a sense of flow. Gloria honored her emotions and created rituals of reflection and connection. They didn't cure their wake-ups, and that wasn't the goal. They embraced them. They softened the edges of their frustration and replaced confusion with care. And slowly, night by night, they discovered a different kind of rest, not always uninterrupted, but deeply human. So if you find yourself awake at 3 a.m., lying in the hush of your own room, know that you're not alone. Your body isn't betraying you. It's inviting you to listen, gently, patiently, without fear. Ask yourself, what do I need? What is shifting in me? What part of me is asking for light? Aging doesn't take away our rhythm. It simply asks us to dance to a quieter beat. And in doing so, it opens space for grace, reflection, and a deeper kind of rest.